For more debates, updates, and bonus content, sign up at thebigconversation.show.
How important do you think that specifically belief in God or God's deity is to the usefulness of religion? So apart from, if you took God out of the picture, the belief in a deity, if it was just the principles, morals and values that have been passed down, would we have benefited just as much?
So what part does the deity part, the belief in God play, as opposed to just the right moral framework and
have we benefited
so
in spite of the belief in God? So going forward, can we come up with a framework that doesn't involve a deity of some kind? Will that be just as effective?
Very insightful question. So the problem is that the deity, you're going to have to accept my terminology here, which is going to be sacrilegious, and I apologize for that, but the deity is a hack, right? It hacks a structure in a way that functions. So if let's just take a trivial example, or a semi-trivial example. Do you take the money out of the cash register if you're pretty sure nobody's going to see you do it, but you're not entitled to it, right? One could say, well, if there's a 1 in 100 chance of my getting caught and the amount of money is sufficient in the cash register to change my state in the world for the next week, maybe it's worth it, right? Well, if you make that decision each and every time the equivalent of a cash register is left open to you, then you will eventually run afoul of the odds. Somebody will catch you, and you will experience a spectacular catastrophe for your reputation, which will cost you way more than you ever got out of any open cash register. So that's a bit of statistics that you need to understand, and you need to understand what economists would call expected return. So the expected return is very low on the cash register because of the spectacular cost the one time you get caught in however many instances. So how do you convey that efficiently so that people get the statistical lesson without having to take the statistics class? Well, you say you can't get away with taking it out of the cash register because there's somebody who cares and he's watching you, and as you take it, he sees it, and boy, is that going to come back to haunt you. So that metaphor correctly hacks your model for whether this is a good idea in a way that is actually in your interests. Now, can you, if you are aware, and again, this is my viewpoint, if you are aware that there's nobody up there actually watching, write a code that is equally effective at getting people not to behave in this way? That's going to be tough. On the other hand, I'm not sure we have a choice. I think we have to figure out how to pass on this kind of insight in a way that does not depend on unfalsifiable belief structures.
I'm going to toss it to Alistair as well in a moment, but the question that occurred to me on hearing that, which is a fascinating way of putting it, Bret, is what you're then saying is that the reason we develop the belief that it's wrong to take money from someone else in that way is because it's ultimately not in our best interests in terms of our evolutionary future, rather than it's actually wrong to do that stuff.
So those two things converge,
okay,
right? So there is an absolute wrong about it, and what one wants is for us to take on the responsibility for not doing it because it is wrong. But how does it become wrong? How do we learn that it is wrong? These things are induced in us through a mechanism. In Catholicism, the fact that you do wrong and that wrong counts against you in a way that you can relieve yourself of the debt, but you have to confess it to somebody who's then in a position to give guidance to you and others, again, it's a hack. It correctly teaches you that this is wrong through some mechanism that has to be instantiated in the real world, and it can be done through metaphor. It must be done now through insight and enlightenment, and that's not going to be easy.
What's your take on this idea that God is a sort of a hack to get us to the right sort of answer, but one that's a useful fiction in that sense?
I think I would say God is creator, and that kind of way moves us in a very different direction. I think there are two things I'd want to say. One is that I think that One of the significant things about believing in a righteous God is this deep sense that when society goes very, very badly wrong, there is something against which we are being judged. And if you look at, for example, Germany during the late 1930s, you see a resurgence of the kind of approach you and I probably call natural law. In other words, look, the law is being rigged to, in effect, do all these things. There has to be somebody above this who's able to say this is not right. And so there's a very deep, I think, sense that we need something which is able to say to us, yes, we created these laws, but actually they are flawed. But I think the more positive point I'd want to make is this. I think that there's a lot of reason to think that we as human beings are trying to see how we fit into a bigger picture. You might think of Crystal Park and others in Chicago doing work on this. But what is interesting is this. If you articulate that in terms of God, then in effect you are fitting into a bigger picture, which actually gives you a sense of who you are, what the whole point of things is. And actually, I don't know if you've read Salman Rushdie's Grantor lecture at Cambridge called Is Nothing Sacred? It's very short. Now, if you read that, he's not expressing total commitment to belief in God, but he figures out that there's something it's saying. Two things. Number one, that God is the repository for our sense of amazement and wonder, which makes us realize that there's something bigger and we're part of it. And then secondly, and really importantly, says that there's something about human nature, which means that a purely, he used the word secular, that needs passing, but you can see what he's getting at, a purely secular worldview actually is not going to satisfy because there's something about us that is looking for something deeper. So I think that's how I'd want to begin to answer that question, but as you can see, there's a lot more that needs to be said.